The kettle screamed, but I couldn't move. His voice still echoed in the room, light and casual, like he'd just mentioned the weather. Getting married tomorrow. Emptied your accounts. Sold the house. 3 sentences. That's all it took. I turned the stove off the handle, burning against my fingers. The tea had boiled over, spilling across the burner, hissing as it hit the metal. I didn't wipe it up. I just stood there, holding the phone in one hand, like it might say something else. Like maybe he'd call back and say it was a joke. He didn't. I walked to the living room. Everything looked the same: sofa, end table, the old recliner. But it all felt off, like the whole house had shifted sideways. I sat down slowly, trying to breathe, but the air felt heavy. My hands trembled just enough to make the phone screen blur. I locked it, put it down. He'd been quiet lately. Months without a visit, a few dry texts, always busy. I should have seen it, but I didn't want to. I thought maybe he was growing, building his own life. I never imagined he'd build it on top of mine. My eyes drifted to the mantel where his baby photo still sat. Chubby cheeks, milk-drunk smile. I used to hum to him while folding his clothes. I gave up weekends, skipped dinners, worked overnights, so he wouldn't feel the gaps his father left behind. And now he was gone too. Not dead. Just cut loose. By choice. With my money. I stood. Not fast. Not with anger. Just enough to stay upright. The drawer I needed was in the back room, the one he never went into. The files were there, folders, deeds, papers I hadn't touched in years. If he thought he'd taken everything, he didn't look close enough. And he definitely didn't look in the locked drawer. I opened the drawer with the small brass key I always kept taped under the edge of my desk. It turned with a soft click, the sound I used to associate with tax season and dull paperwork. Now it sounded like armor. The bottom drawer held every important document I'd ever kept stacked in neat folders labeled in my late husband's handwriting. He'd been meticulous, and I'd kept the habit. Birth certificates, insurance forms, car titles, and the trust. I pulled it out, unzipped the folder, and flipped to the page that mattered. The house had been placed into a living land trust in 2001. My name was on the title, yes, but not in the way Eli thought. I wasn't the owner anymore. Not directly. The trust held the property, and the trustee was someone he'd never met, a friend of my husband's from the union. The house wasn't mine to sell, and certainly not his. So whatever he forged, it wasn't valid. Not for this address. My hands didn't shake as much now. That part of me, my home, was safe. But the other part wasn't. I turned to the second folder. The bank accounts. I kept printouts even if the app was more convenient. The numbers on the last statement had dropped to 0, checking and savings. Drained. I'd trusted him with access after I fell last year, just in case. I'd said, if something happens. Something had. $87,000. That was my security blanket, my fallback plan, the comfort I let myself have after a lifetime of denying comforts. It was for roof repairs, emergencies, maybe a decent burial when the time came. Now it was gone. Not spent with permission, not even discussed. Just taken. I put the folders back and locked the drawer. I didn't call the bank. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room and stared at the old rotary phone on the dresser. There was someone else I needed to call first. The woman at the credit union sounded kind but distant, like she'd given this same explanation 100 times before. Yes, Ms. Drayton. The transfers were made over the last 4 weeks. Gradually, until the final withdrawal 2 days ago. She paused almost gently. He had full access. Your authorization form was signed last October. I thanked her, though the words felt sour on my tongue. I hung up and sat very still. I remembered that October. I'd tripped on the front steps, landed wrong, bruised my hip and ego. I didn't tell Eli right away. When I did, he didn't come by. Just texted glad you're okay. You should look into one of those fall detectors. Then a link to a video of a senior getting rescued by a wristband. I should have said no when he offered to help, but I was tired. Tired of being alone in emergencies. Tired of fighting with paper forms and passwords and not knowing who to call if something happened. So I added him to the account. Just in case he'd said, "What if you fall again?" I thought he meant protection. I thought I meant trust. Now I knew it was just access. There was no password to change, no fraud to report. He didn't hack me. He didn't steal. Not by their definition. I'd opened the door and left the light on. I tried to remember the last time he asked me anything, really asked, not for money, not for help. Just asked how I was, what I needed, whether I'd eaten that day or wanted company. I couldn't remember. He used to ask everything. Why the sky was blue, how I knew when soup was ready, whether his father was proud of him. Somewhere between soccer cleats and job applications, he'd stopped asking. I looked out the window, watching the wind move through the grass. It was still my yard, still my air. And if I had nothing left in the bank, I still had the truth, and I knew exactly where he'd gone wrong. I opened the envelope with steady fingers, though I already suspected what it was. A closing notice. Bold letters at the top. Folded forms. A printed signature line, mine but not mine. And the address in clean font, 928 Tanager Drive. Not my house. Next door. He thought he was clever. He took documents from my drawer when I wasn't looking, probably last summer, when he dropped by with that takeout box, and left after 5 minutes. He knew enough to forge my name, to download blank sale forms online, to make it look real. But he didn't know how the house was titled, because it hadn't been mine, not directly, for over 2 decades. After my husband passed in 2001, I sat through probate court with our neighbor Jean. I watched her kids tear each other apart over square footage and bank statements. I promised myself Eli would never go through that. So I transferred the deed into a living land trust with a neutral trustee, someone outside the family. Quiet, clean, legal. I never told Eli. Not because I didn't trust him, back then I did, but because I didn't want him to think the house was something he'd inherit like a watch or a photo album. I wanted him to build his own, not wait for mine. And now he'd forged his way into a mess he didn't understand. I looked again at the address on the closing notice. Jean's old house. She'd moved to assisted living last fall. Her son Thomas was planning to sell but hadn't finalized it yet. Somehow, Eli had pulled the wrong file, lifted the wrong forms, and pretended to be me. For a house that wasn't mine, or his. I folded the letter, placed it beside the trust paperwork, and picked up the phone. Jean's son needed to know what just happened, and I knew exactly who else to call after that. Lyle showed up just after 10, carrying a file box that looked heavier than it should have. Same buzz cut, same creased shirt sleeves, like time had only passed for the rest of us. He gave me a quiet nod before setting the box on the kitchen table and opening the lid. No small talk, just work. Show me what he used, he said. I slid the closing notice across the table. He read it once, then again, more slowly. Then he reached into his box and pulled out a yellow legal pad, started writing. He didn't just use your name. He used digital systems across state lines. That's not just identity theft, Marvel. That's interstate wire fraud. I poured him coffee black like he always took it. He didn't thank me, just took a sip and kept reading. That's how I knew he was serious. I slid him the forged signature page, the bank statement I printed out, and the access form Eli signed last fall. Lyle stacked them carefully, his jaw locked tight. Your kid is in deeper than he knows. I nodded. He thinks he's clever. He's not. He's traceable. We sat for a while in silence, just the soft ticking of the wall clock and the scrape of his pen on paper. Then he pulled out a form with an official seal and placed it in front of me. Let me file this. quietly. It's not just about the money, is it? No, I said. It's about the line he crossed. Lyle tapped the edge of the page. If we move now, we'll catch him before he leaves the country. That account number you gave me, he's using it to book a flight. Honeymoon, probably. Vegas wedding Reno. He gave a dry chuckle. Close enough. I signed where he pointed. The ink settled into the paper like it had been waiting. As Lyle packed the forms back into his file box, I walked to the stove and refilled his cup, then mine. The hard part wasn't the paperwork. It was what came after. The phone buzzed while I was rinsing my cup. I glanced at the screen expecting nothing important and nearly dropped it. A group text. One I hadn't been included in for years. There was Eli smiling too wide wearing a white tuxedo that looked rented and ill-fitting. Beside him stood a woman I'd never seen before. Dark hair pulled tight lips painted sharp. They were standing in front of a beige building with a seal on the door. No flowers, no family, no warmth, just a courthouse in Reno. I enlarged the photo and looked closer. His left hand rested awkwardly at his side. No ring, hers too. Bare fingers. So this was the wedding he'd rushed me off the phone for. Not planned, not celebrated, just sealed and done. Before I could process that, another message slid onto the screen. This one wasn't a photo. It was from Thomas Jean's son, my former neighbor. Marvell, did you sell your place to someone named Eli? I came home and there were two men carrying furniture into my living room. They said they bought the house yesterday. My chest tightened. I sat down slowly, the chair scraping against the floor louder than it should have. I typed back with steady fingers. No, I didn't sell anything. Please tell them to stop and leave the house immediately. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. They already left, he wrote. But the locks were changed. I stared at the message until the words blurred. This wasn't just my problem anymore. This wasn't just money or betrayal or a son who'd crossed a line. Someone else had been dragged into it. Someone innocent. I opened the photo again. Eli's grin looked thinner now. Desperate, like a man sprinting ahead of consequences, hoping speed would save him. It wouldn't. I forwarded Thomas's message to Lyle without adding a single word. Then I turned the phone face down on the table and waited for the next call. I didn't do much that week, just the basics. Dishes, laundry, watered the front plants. The hose had a slow leak I kept meaning to fix, but I let it drip. Everything else could wait. The paperwork was done. My part, anyway. I signed what Lyle brought me. I called the credit union again and closed every account with Eli's name on it. I shredded old statements until the machine overheated. But mostly, I waited. I didn't call him. Didn't text. He didn't either. Maybe he thought I wouldn't notice until they were already gone. Maybe he was counting on my silence. Lyle called just after 8 a.m. on Friday. I was halfway through folding towels. He's booked on a 10:35 to Belize, he said, flying out of Indianapolis. They'll intercept him at Gate 4, local and federal both involved. I didn't ask for details, didn't ask what he'd be charged with or what they'd say. I just thanked him and hung up. I didn't drive to the airport. What would I do? Watch from the terminal. See him turn pale when they took his arm, when the badge flashed, when the honeymoon turned to handcuffs. No, I didn't need to be there. Instead, I stayed home, made cornbread my mother's recipe with just a little honey in the batter, the kind Eli used to beg for when he was 7. I sat in the sunroom windows cracked open just enough to let the October air drift through. The house smelled like warmth again, like something solid. I rocked slowly in the chair. Listened to the breeze press against the screens. No sirens, no knocks, no drama. just the steady rhythm of justice arriving on someone else's clock. He thought he'd taken the house, that it would be empty. But the walls were still mine, the floors too, and the space between them had never felt more steady. I let the silence stretch across the room, unbroken. Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and set out 2 plates, just in case Lyle stopped by. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that seeps up through your shoes and settles in your bones. I kept my hands folded in my lap and stared straight ahead while people shuffled papers and whispered names that meant nothing to me. Eli sat 2 rows away. In that suit, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not younger, just reduced. Like someone had taken the outline of the boy I raised and erased the parts that once filled the space. His lawyer spoke first. Calm, confident. Your Honor? My client believed he had permission. There was access. There was implied consent. I didn't react. I'd learned that stillness unnerved people more than anger. The prosecutor stood next. Bank statements appeared on a screen, dates highlighted in yellow. Transfers lined up like footsteps leading away from my account. Then the forged documents, my name written in a hand that tried too hard to look like mine. Then Thomas took the stand. He spoke clearly, without drama, about coming home to strangers inside his house. The story collapsed under its own weight. When Eli spoke, his voice wavered just enough to sound sincere. He said he was under pressure, that he panicked, that he planned to fix everything after the wedding. He never said my name. The judge listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, the room went quiet in a way that felt permanent. 3 counts, she said. Interstate fraud, forgery, unlawful transfer of funds. Sentence of 4 years suspended pending compliance. Full restitution ordered. The words landed one after another, heavy but controlled. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Just final. Eli stared straight ahead as if I wasn't there. Not once did he turn his head. Not when the sentence was read. Not when the gavel struck. Not when people began to stand. I watched him be led out through the side door, shoulders tight, jaw set. He disappeared without looking back. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the cold settle, letting the echo fade. When I stood, my legs felt steady. I walked out of the courtroom alone, already knowing what I would change when I got home. The locksmith arrived at 9 sharp and was gone by 10. I watched from the porch as he slid the old cylinders into his case and handed me 3 new keys, shiny, cold, untouched. I didn't make copies. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk, going through every document one by one. His name was removed from the credit union, from the emergency contacts at the clinic, from the binder labeled "What to Do if I'm gone." It felt like erasing pencil from a page. Not permanent ink, just something that had lingered too long where it didn't belong. My pension covered the legal costs. Not comfortably, but enough. I started moving what little I had left into a separate credit union across town. Opened a savings account in a name only I knew. The manager asked if I wanted to add a beneficiary. I shook my head. Not yet. Thomas had his mother's house back. The locks were changed there too. I dropped off a casserole and didn't stay long. We didn't talk about Eli. There was nothing left to say. 3 weeks later, a card arrived. No stamp. Just slipped through the slot. A plain white envelope. No return address. Inside, 5 words written in shaky ink I didn't know. I'm sorry. No signature, no explanation. Just a sentence. I held it in my hand for a few seconds. Then I opened the shredder drawer and fed it through slowly, the blades humming softly as the words disappeared into strips. I didn't need an apology that cost nothing. I didn't need it arriving after lawyers, after lies, after fingerprints on documents I never touched. Some things come too late to be useful. That night, I stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom. The sheets were freshly laundered. The window opened just enough for the air to stir. The door creaked when I closed it, but the lock turned smoothly. For the first time in months, I slept without checking the front window. And in the morning, I opened the shades without hesitation. The days fell into rhythm again. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it sit where it wanted, by the kitchen window, in the space beside my morning coffee, in the hush after dinner, when the house was still but not lonely. I started writing down passwords again in a small notebook that stayed in my bedside drawer. No backups, no digital cloud, just paper and ink where only I could reach. I made baked oats on Sundays even if no one joined me. No fuss, no ceremony, just something warm that belonged to me. I cleaned out the spice rack, replaced things that had sat too long, learned the difference between what I used and what I kept, just in case someone else might want it. On walks, I passed the empty lot where Jean's house once stood. After the court cleared things, her son sold it. The buyer tore it down, left the ground bare. Just grass and one bent mailbox that still had her name faintly etched on the side. That was the house Eli thought he'd taken. I always nodded at it when I passed, not out of bitterness, but because it reminded me how close I came to being erased. There were no calls from him, no updates. I didn't ask around. I figured if he wanted to be found, he knew where I lived. But I also knew he'd lost the right to just walk in. I still turned on the porch light every evening. Habit. It wasn't for anyone in particular. It was for the home itself, for the comfort of coming back to a place that had already decided to stay. I kept the spare keys in a drawer near the door. All of them copies of mine. None of them handed out. That's how I liked it now. When people asked if I lived alone, I said yes. But it never felt like less. It felt like something hard-earned, something whole. And the lock on the front door. It turned easy, but only when I wanted it to.